The 2020 coronavirus pandemic took the Earth by storm. Like other cataclysms in history, this virus has devastated our modern society today, facilitating a mass exodus from many workplaces as millions took to the indoors and video calls to do their jobs, where millions of others lost their jobs completely. Based on the reactions of the many, often facilitated by the media, it would seem as though the pandemic was a deadly killer. Panic and fear swept through mass consciousness. But the question many are asking themselves is this fear necessary? When looking at the science, one might question whether COVID-19 even deserves the tag of pandemic at all. According to the US Center for Disease Control, the updated age group survival rates for COVID-19 are as follows. Ages 0 to 19 have a 99.997 chance of survival. Ages 20 to 49 have a 99.98 chance of survival. Ages 50 to 69 have a 99.5 chance of survival. And ages 70 plus have a 94.6 chance of survival. These mortality rates are nearly identical, only ever so slightly higher than the human toll from the seasonal flu, and are also significantly lower mortality rates than many other ailments for the same age groups. Even if we look at the US right now, with a population of 328 million people as of the 2019 census records, basic math will tell you that the 238,000 deaths amount to only 0.07% of the total population. Similarly, with the UK, even with its rise in cases, its 49,000 deaths only amount to 0.07%. This is not intended to reduce people to a number, for of course the deceased meant something to someone, and many loved ones have been lost in this time. For those looking outside of the mainstream narrative, many have questioned the authenticity of the story and fear perpetuated by the media and governments since the very beginning, with at least 1/3 of Americans believing that COVID itself was made in a lab and that the event was purposefully planned. Theories as to why include everything from being a method to quell overpopulation to a means to mass vaccinate people with a specific chemical, drug, or nanoparticle that could make people easier to control or even tamper with their DNA, making raising consciousness difficult or nigh impossible. So far, almost all of the effort and attempts to discuss this outside of the mainstream narrative have been banned across nearly all social media channels, and one particularly powerful documentary and its creator being not just silenced everywhere, but violently attacked by the mainstream media itself. Naturally, we are fully prepared for this video and all of our Conspiracy Theory of Everything series to be removed from YouTube, and that's why we've created Spirit Conspiracies, a free collection of censored content and a private workshop hosted on a secure and safe platform. You can get free access to this by clicking the link at the top of the description. Nevertheless, as time has gone on, a new term has been coined to describe what many are believing to be the true intention behind this pandemic: the Great Reset. Back in mid-August, former Australian Senator Cory Bernardi presented a piece for Sky News Australia in which he claimed that the agenda behind the pandemic was for elite Davos billionaires to bring about a great reset that would see permanent social and economic changes. Bernardi described that there was something unusual about the continuing pandemic panic, citing medical experts who now acknowledge that lockdowns don't work, and actually asking the audience to consider if there's another agenda at work. To add further weight to this conversation, Bernardi then highlighted comments by Klaus Schwab, the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, who described that COVID-19 proved the old systems of society to be inadequate, and that now is the historical moment of time not only to fight the virus, but to shape the system for the post-corona era. Now, the World Economic Forum itself is an elite gathering of businessmen, politicians, and celebrities that happens every year in Davos, Switzerland. Their mission is stated as being committed to improving the state of the world by engaging business, political, academic, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industry agendas. To that end, many attendees use the opportunity to hold private meetings on things like investment in their countries and as a chance to do business deals. Interestingly, until the financial crash of 2008, attending Davos was considered a must for the great and good. But since then, critics have suggested that it is a symbol of the global elite, some of whom are to blame for that same very crisis. One particular Time magazine editor described Davos as a family reunion for the people who broke the modern world. Today, the modern definition of conspire includes several terms. One speaks to planning together to commit an illegal or wrongful act or accomplish a legal purpose through illegal action. And another is more innocuous, simply to join or act together, combine. As these billionaires, political leaders, celebrities, and other titans of industry gathered together to make private business deals that ultimately shape the fabric of society as we know it, whether for good or for ill, they do fall into at least one of the definitions of conspire. And so, speaking to the Great Reset, to some this idea of a planned rewrite of global systems may be just a conspiracy theory. The truth is, it's not. It's not a theory at all. A book and live-streamed panel published by the World Economic Forum themselves, titled COVID-19: The Great Reset, outlines their views in great detail. In the opening of their book, Schwab and Mallory openly state that even though many of us are pondering when things will return to normal, the short answer is never. Nothing will ever return to the broken sense of normalcy that prevailed prior to this crisis, because the coronavirus marks a fundamental inflection point in our global trajectory. The world as we knew it in the early months of 2020 is gone, dissolved in the context of this pandemic. Such radical changes of extreme consequences are coming that some experts are now referring to a before coronavirus, BC, and after coronavirus, AC era. As they explain rather eloquently, reality would much likely be more nuanced and not as black and white as the plague alone changing society. Instead, they highlight the fact that the seemingly biblical events of 2020 will most likely accelerate many of the changes that were already taking place before it, naturally setting in motion a new trajectory in the months and years to come. Historically, plague outbreaks have brought about changes on a worldwide scale that far exceeded just health concerns. Riots, famine, war, and clashes, and the redrawing of national boundaries are all historical precedents. The Black Death signaled the final stages of the medieval period and gave birth to the Renaissance. The plague of Justinian caused the Byzantine Empire to change course, and the smallpox epidemic all but wiped out the Inca and Mesoamerican empires. The World Economic Forum's panel and book creates a conceptual framework for how such a change would be brought about, dividing its events into macro categories like the economy, political, environmental, and technological factors, and micro categories that focus on specific companies and industries. The final category, however, relates to the personal consequences and how the event so far will alter who we are as humans on a fundamental level. To start, the financial impact alone would put the world in such a large sum of debt that future generations would be paying it off indefinitely. The essence of the 21st century, however, is interdependence. We are more connected than ever, and our world is entrenched in a deep systemic connectivity. As such, any economic risk has the potential to turn into a political one, which we've already seen with high unemployment rates and dissatisfaction with governments, sparking the fires of civil unrest. We have also seen the technical repercussions of things like the tracking apps for COVID, which have sparked massive social backlash. But the reset goes much deeper. See, each risk event, like COVID, not only affects the other factors in its own macro, like the economy and society, but also affects the consequences of all other aspects of society. Each individual risk creates a kind of ricochet that provokes other risks in seemingly unrelated areas of society. The World Economic Forum's predictions argue that infectious diseases like COVID will undoubtedly create changes in everything from global governance failure, social instability, and unemployment to involuntary migration. Describing their plans further, they have put forth first that an increased sense of security and inclusiveness is inevitable to mitigate the social unrest and unemployment. But above that, we must move into a more sustainable method of living, as the next big crisis waiting for us is the climate crisis, and we are heading straight for it. Speaking to this further, their plan is to redefine our social contract to be more inclusive with each other, setting up systems where we can leave solutions and responsibility to the next generation as well as our problems. Social contract, basically put, is the glue that binds society together. Without it, society unravels. One of the biggest changes that is needed is in regards to inflation. For years, the rate of inflation has fallen for many goods and services, with the exception of the three things that matter the most for many of us: housing, healthcare, and education. In all of these things, prices have only risen, creating and widening the societal gap, even as much as forcing families into debt for medical treatment or college education. What form a new social contract will take is difficult to imagine because it depends on the culture and history of each country. What makes a good change for China won't be the same for the US. In general, though, there are some universals that are being argued for. A broader, if not universal, provision for social assistance, including insurance and healthcare, and a move towards protecting the most vulnerable. Next, with the three main agreed upon consensus for how COVID is going to spread further into the year, Schwab argues that the world economy can never truly recover until COVID is defeated or put behind us. As such, we will need to decarbonize the economy, that is, reduce our CO2 output to avert the next virus that might very well be climatic in nature. Further, we should move into a phase that there is no distinction between what is good for nature versus what is good for the economy. In order to survive, we must move into a nature-based economy, which supposedly has been fully costed and studied by the experts at the World Economic Forum. The other main consequence of COVID is the increasing digitization of things and a move more into cloud computing. Gone are the days of filing cabinets and paper documents, because with COVID, offices can no longer function in the way that they have been. Tech companies have almost fast-forwarded several years in terms of necessity and remote everything. Even our monetary exchange has changed, with many shops in the UK refusing to accept physical cash now, instead opting for a contactless-only option with credit cards. The bottom line here is that most of the things that have defined us so far have now become e-things. The problem ensues, however, with an increased reliance on digital activity. How we use such things, the privacy issues surrounding them, and how we evolve with them is of paramount importance. Perhaps companies themselves will change and our investment system will move away from shareholder capitalism towards stakeholder capitalism. If COVID has shown us anything, it's that companies who invest into their own longevity and focus more on adaptation than short-term profits are the ones who will survive. Finally, an increased effort for global communication and aid is one of the things that will define us well into the future. No longer can we act as individual nations fighting our own battles. We must work together to survive. In the early 2010s, Kishore Mahbubani, a former diplomat and academic from Singapore, captured the essence of this with his metaphor of a boat. The 7 billion people who inhabit Earth no longer live in more than 100 separate boats. Instead, we live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. When asked his opinion on the current crisis in 2020, Kishore responded, "If we 7.5 billion people are now stuck together on a virus-infected cruise ship, does it make sense to clean and scrub only your personal cabin while ignoring the corridors and airwells outside through which the virus travels? Obviously not, but that is what we've been doing, and since we are all now in the same boat, humanity must take care of the global boat as a whole to prevent us from sinking collectively." While all of this sounds good and well on its surface, and certainly could be a bright and promising future under the right leadership, the questioning surfacing in many minds, especially in those who criticize the World Economic Forum's Great Reset stance, is how did this really come about? Was this all planned in advance in order to establish a new, unified global government? Questioning the mainstream narrative behind all that is happening right now often yields to a very mixed response, but the biggest danger is that so far, the large social network giants, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and even all of Google themselves, have notoriously banned any content that purports difference of opinion, especially if it includes evidence to the contrary. To many, it certainly seems as though we are at war for humanity's thoughts, minds, and consciousness. As technology evolves, our ability to manipulate nature grows with it. We have domesticated plants and animals and can bring rain on demand, affect hurricanes, induce earthquakes, split atoms, and we are now able to genetically engineer viruses for purposes like manipulating agriculture or fighting illness in humans. Once mystic forces are now well within our grasp. Though taming the chaos of nature is an underlying aspiration of a prosperous society, at every step in our evolutionary path, our new discoveries and abilities open up Pandora's box further, and our recent history of genetically engineered viruses is no different. As efforts are exhausted to create viruses that will modify DNA and cure complex illnesses like cancer without harming the host, a failure of healing presents a potential for the chaotic spread of disease. It is not at all far-fetched to say that humans have brought to life deadly viruses. In fact, we seem to do it all the time, and scientists are growing worried that unleashing do-it-yourself plagues will only become easier as technology progresses. But in that case, what about COVID? Well, scientists at the University of North Carolina, in collaboration with the Wuhan Institute for Virology, an institute which shares its city with ground zero of COVID-19, in 2015, under the intention of fighting early what horrors may await us in the future, envisioned and brought to life a chimeric virus with the spike of a bat coronavirus and the backbone of a mouse-adapted one, achieving cross-species spread from bat to human cells. Their attempts at immunotherapy were unsuccessful. In just 4 years' time from this research, we find ourselves in a global pandemic featuring a mutated coronavirus from Wuhan, able to infect humans. It's important not to get too sensational just yet though. In 2002, SARS-CoV did mutate to infect humans, and it's natural that in a place like China, with an active population of wild bats and other animals carrying coronaviruses, that its institutes would be concerned and involved in research. Yet, given the nature of certain and timely coincidences, we would expect the scientific community to adhere to a greater burden of proof that COVID-19 mutated naturally to infect humans. What we got instead was silence and censorship. If the scientific community won't provide us with answers, we will go looking ourselves. For those that were silenced, we seek to listen, and on the taboos of our time, we withhold judgment. Where there is secrecy, we will explore potential motives of foul play. From what mainstream science has told us, COVID-19 is a mutation of a bat coronavirus which has the ability to infect human cells. Apart from the aforementioned circumstances of the virus originating in the same location as a virology lab, which works on coronaviruses and has collaborated in engineering one which spreads from wildlife species to human cells, the most puzzling aspect of COVID-19 is just how good it is at infecting humans in particular. You see, coronaviruses begin their infection by attaching their protein spikes, the signature coronas sticking out of it, to what is called an ACE2 receptor found in whatever organism it finds itself in. The reason that most coronaviruses, despite our exposure to them, do not cause pandemics is largely due to the fact that the protein spikes usually are not adapted to bind to the human receptors. But in rare instances, during normal mutation, the virus may produce a strain with the capability to infect new species of hosts. If COVID-19 is a coronavirus that mutated to work on humans, what specifically did it mutate from? The answers are a bit questionable. And it's not just that COVID-19 is good at binding to human receptors. Human receptors are COVID-19's favorite receptors. You see, all species have slightly different ACE2 receptors, which affects the range of hosts that coronavirus species are able to infect. When scientists tested how effective COVID-19 was at binding to different species' ACE2 receptors, they discovered that its affinity to those of the humans was greater than every other species tested, including bat. What's stranger still is that the human-adapted coronavirus from 2002 also favored humans, but only after infecting and mutating within them for months. COVID-19 came to humans at what appeared to be a human-optimized stage in evolution. The mainstream explanation for the origin of this virus is from a bat strain of coronavirus called RATG13, which shares a 96% genetic identity with COVID-19, and it is purported that certain mutation allowed the virus to unlock its potential to infect humans so effectively. So what do we know about COVID-19's supposed precursor, RATG13? The official story isn't all too reassuring. The scientists who linked COVID-19 to RATG13 claim to have had samples of the virus since 2013. These same scientists being researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who worked on genetically modifying coronaviruses in the past. Not only is the existence of RATG13 before COVID-19 dubious, but if it was so near to being a deadly and super efficient human coronavirus and known about 7 years before it mutated, why were we not more prepared? It's not like we haven't had near misses with a mutating coronavirus before, yet somehow the institute most cognizant of this danger waited until something terrible happened to draw attention to a virus primed to mutate and cause the pandemic we are in today. So what are we left to believe? Our best case scenario is that scientists most familiar with coronaviruses knew of and ignored a deadly strain just a few steps away from infecting humans. Past that, it's not crazy to imagine that RATG13 strain used to explain COVID-19's origin is actually a fabrication to conceal the genetic modification of COVID, which opens up a whole new can of worms. Either scenario seems to suggest some level of knowledge in advance of this pandemic coming. Yet in the 7 years since RATG13 was supposedly discovered, the world became no more prepared and was caught way off guard by its close relative. Just looking at the scientific data on different coronaviruses cannot prove or disprove that COVID-19 was engineered or released on purpose by humans. Although it's interesting to note that Sky News recently interviewed a former MI6 chief who said definitively that it was made in a lab, but that its release was an accident. But perhaps even with all of the curious pieces of information we've looked at so far, the thing that really kickstarted so much curiosity is that taking the position of open-mindedness or skepticism is met with harsh institutional shame, criticism, and even censorship. This pandemic began with panic, hoarding of food and toilet paper, and uncertainty, and was followed closely by swift and decisive action which rippled into a mandated worldwide lockdown. Unlike other disasters with tangible effects like hurricanes, fires, or famines, a pandemic acts like a poltergeist across the world. You can't see or physically sense it. We have to trust sources of authority to mold our understanding of how it behaves, and of course, where it came from, as well as the best actions we can take against it. But what if those sources of authority were untrustworthy? As we go digging down the rabbit hole, what we find is a litany of information to suggest that this virus was definitively planned or put forth from a very high level of authority. However, and what is truly upsetting here, is that the mainstream media and social network giants have sent a very clear message to the world. Deeper investigation or purporting certain conversations, areas we seek to go, will not be tolerated and will be flagged and removed on the spot. We have received this warning from YouTube loud and clear, and so we had to ask ourselves, is it worth publishing anyways if it will just be taken down moments later? Is it worth publishing if it means the potential shutting down of our channel, which seeks to help facilitate the evolution of consciousness? As important as this is to explore and discuss, we want to make sure that the future is one with spirit science in it. And so this is where this shorter public edition must unfortunately come to a close. But if you're ready to take the red pill and discover the truth about the origins of the pandemic and the seemingly nefarious agendas behind it, please join us inside of Spirit Conspiracies, and we'll show you how deep the rabbit hole really goes.